So I had actually I didn't get a chance to watch some Monarchs when it played Sundance earlier in the year. So when I saw that was playing at the Atlanta Film Festival, I actually got pretty excited to be able to catch up to it. And
Yeah,
I'm really glad I did. It's a lovely film. It really gives you a lot to think about, I think.
thank you.
What was the inspiration behind the movie?
Well, there's quite a few. I mean, the film is somewhat of a it's my second feature, and it's somewhat of a semi biographical film because it's about I was a biologist for many years before becoming a filmmaker, and I remember that when I was doing my PhD, I was doing a PhD in New York. I was having kind of a bit of an existential crisis where I was trying to figure out where I belonged and my roots, and it was at the time where my grandmother died. So it was an interesting. It's sort of after the fact I realized that it was a little bit related to my own life, but that's one of the inspirations. The other kind of origin of the film was around the monarch butterfly becoming a symbol for migrant rights,
Hmm.
because of the fact that the monarch butterfly migrates, from Canada through the U.S. to Mexico, and it became kind of the symbol. I started seeing it in protests where people would say, I'm a monarch, I should have the right to migrate freely. And so these ideas came together. I've always been interested in combining science and spirituality as well. So that was another big element in kind of in my life is, I went into science because of kind of because I was interested in kind of the more than just the science. I was interested in kind of the metaphysical aspect of like learning about science and what it means to look at like genes and the origins of life and those types of things. So those were kind of some of the, it's always hard to figure out how a film is born. It takes so many years to make, but it's definitely it's based quite a bit on my life, to some extent.
When you transitioned from being a scientist to being a filmmaker, were there any particular traits or ways of thinking that you transitioned over with when you became a filmmaker?
Yeah, I speak quite a bit about this because I feel like scientists and filmmakers and scientists and artists in general, it's a very similar process because when you're working in a lab, you have to do these kind of isolated experiments, but then you have to craft a story out of them, and there's a technical expertise of doing research, but there's also the ability of creating stories and pitching kind of research. Of course, there's a big component of it in my research because I was working on kind of the genetics of vision, which was interesting because it connected to cinema to some extent. But there's also kind of the imaging aspect of science, right?
Mm-hmm.
Using microscopes, capturing the world. So in many ways, my training as a scientist helped me quite a bit in organizing my brain. When I was making films, it wasn't so much a transition because I grew up in a my mom's a filmmaker, my dad's a painter, so I
Hmm.
sort of grew up in an environment where I was surrounded by actors and I was on film sets once in a while, but I think that the science gave me my kind of the brain, and also kind of ideas which I delve into in some of my films. I'm also really fascinated by animals and why we study animals and how we are animals and these types of comments. So, you know, to some extent, I like to think of myself still as a biologist. I am a biologist still, but my kind of my modus operandi, like the way I operate, is using cameras and telling stories about in those worlds.
Mm-hmm. The character Mendel in this film, I found him to be pretty insular in the way he projects his emotions and the way he takes in the world and takes in different the way people are uh, talking to him, just the communication between humans. And I mean, I think that's definitely a scientific approach, but I think that's one of the things that really makes that such. And I can understand for some people not really making it easy to connect with him as the main character of the movie, but I think it really makes it more it makes it easier for me at least to connect to him because of the fact that when those emotions come out,
Yeah.
when he starts to express himself, it just makes it that much more impactful.
Yeah.
Um, what was the thought process behind writing the character?
Yeah, it's a very good observation actually, Brian, because that was one of the things that I struggled with, but I wanted to kind of stay firm about this idea that he was having kind of like this internal battle, and he was actually very repressed and not able to really share his feelings and emotions. And in a way, he starts out like that, almost like he undergoes a metamorphosis. But early on in the film, everything is kind of contained and repressed, and his safe spot is being in the lab, being alone, being able to kind of meditate. And it's not easy to create those characters because oftentimes, when you create characters in film, it's not easy to create characters that are kind of silent, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And as you said, the moments where he actually bursts out into emotions, especially at the end of the film with his brother, when like basically they end up crying. I think, yeah, it's so impactful. But one of the techniques that I tried to employ was to envision a little bit his interior world. That was a big part of what I was trying to do. His dreams, his fantasies, his imagination, him getting lost in the microscope, and at some points imagining that he was under the microscope, and so those were kind of my ways of getting into his head, was through kind of those dreamscapes and those fantasies and the laboratory shots, and of course the voiceover. He speaks over himself to some extent. He actually only starts speaking in voiceover towards kind of 30 minutes into the film, but it's almost like this inner state is slowly waking up,
Mm-hmm.
from hibernation, which was an analogy with the butterflies, because the butterflies hibernate. They sleep for many months before flying. So all of that was important for me to kind of take the image of the monarch butterfly also and use that as a reference to build him as a character. But there was a lot of work with the actor in terms of kind of getting into that mindset. And he's played many different roles that, kind of being an introvert scientist was new for him. He was just coming out of Narcos like a few months before that. So definitely a different type of role. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It speaks to the universality of your film, even though it's very specific in the story it's telling. I thought about times where I've gone back to where I grew up, and how that impacted me, and how I sort of, it was not only a time for me to sort of decompress and sort of, you know, to relax to a certain extent, but it also allowed me to really think about um, who I was at the moments when I was growing up in that area compared to who I am now, and just sort of reconciling that. And I think that's one of the really lovely arcs that Mendel goes through in this film. And it really does speak to a universality about the film, where even though you're touching on ideas of migration, immigration, climate change, and just the ways that the modern world seems to be dividing us a little bit more in terms of how we interact with nature, that there is something that's universal that's coming out of this film.
yeah, yeah, I definitely you hit on a very important point there, which is, one is our disconnect with nature. The other one is that we're made up of so many different identities, and the idea of returning home, as you were mentioning. Because I think I spoke to a lot of people that saw the film, in the post production, and also in kind of the early, because we're just at the beginning of kind of the festival life of the film, but it speaks to a lot of people that have migrated, right? And
Hmm.
this idea of returning home, because what's interesting about returning home is that there's a sense of familiarity, but there's also kind of a sense of, as you were saying, you're like returning to another self of you, like another,
Hmm.
you're imagining yourself in another context, but then you have people that haven't left that still think of you in that way. And I mean, it happens to me because I'm it, whether it's even within the same country, like between different states, but I grew up between France and the US, and my mom is from Venezuela, and to some extent everywhere I went, I was considered to be kind of a foreigner.
Hmm.
Nobody ever actually, so whenever I would go back to France, it'd be like, oh, you live in the US, when I was in. So I thought it was interesting to kind of speak about those multiple identities that we don't often see. A lot of times in films, it's about going somewhere and then staying there. You know,
Hmm.
and especially for, I mean, let's not even get into the whole, what happens with Mexican kind of representations or Latinos, because that's even more problematic because of, there's a very specific way which we see Latinos in film that I wanted to break away from.
Hmm.
That we don't, not every Latino is kind of crossing the border or undocumented. There are many artists and scientists, and of course that's been my experience. So, and I thought that was an important, even though it's a little bit more of a privileged migration, it was an important story to
Hmm.
tell.
Were there any particular the movie is really striking from a visual standpoint at some points, especially when he's in Mexico, especially when you see the monarch butterflies on the screen. Were there any particular challenges that you had to in capturing those images?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, before we were able to get access to the butterfly sanctuaries in Mexico, in the state of Michoacan, where they arrive and they hibernate there for a few months. One of the complicated aspects of shooting there is it's in the state of Michoacan, which is also a relatively dangerous part of Mexico. It's where a lot of the cartels are. So Michoacan is known for two things, for like drugs and butterflies. So that's those are the two things they're known for. But it took me a few years to go. I went there. I also spoke to the people that work in the biosphere that protect the forest. The fact that I was a biologist helped me get access, but I had to spend a lot of time, doing research, making short films,
Hmm.
and then eventually they gave us access to. Not only they gave us access to, because most of the time when they give access to these places, it's for like Nat Geo, or
Hmm.
Discovery Channel. But the idea of creating a fiction was also an independent fiction film. I explained to them that this was also a film that was about the town, was about immigration and these topics. And so they gave us access, and they also let us film right where the butterflies sleep, which is where the colonies are. So those first images of you see in the film, all of the butterflies are sleeping, and you're actually not allowed to go there as the public because it's such a delicate,
Hmm.
they're sleeping, and if you even like disturb them, they can all fall to the ground and die. So we had to basically hike for 4 hours. We were only allowed to be like 6 or 7 people. We weren't allowed to have any reflectors, anything to disturb and we had to shoot in complete silence.
Hmm.
And I remember, yeah, it was very emotional because it was just, it was, and we were shooting with the kids also that had to kind of whisper and be very kind of careful there. But you know, it was also kind of a bit of a improvisational because we didn't know, everywhere you pointed the camera, there were butterflies. I mean, it was like millions of butterflies. And so a lot of the dialogue that came from the kids was somewhat, some of it was scripted, but some of it was improvised based on their reaction and kind of their experience there. And one of the opening shots of the film is these butterflies that are in the shape of a bear.
Hmm.
It kind of creates like
Yeah.
bear structure. Yeah. And the kid says it looks like a bear. And so all of that was kind of unscripted, just with the kids. But it was very important for us to work with the organization, the conservation groups, the guides, and make sure that we did things properly. And of course, the film was then seen by them, and everybody's so excited about it. And it's these are as is mentioned in the film, these are parts of the country that are riddled with economic, they're going through like very, very difficult times. It's hard to attract tourists, especially now with the pandemic. It's been very, very hard hit. So, so there's a lot. I hope that the film helps kind of restore a better image, and helps, people come, because they for the most part, they survive off of butterfly tourism.
Mhm. If there's anything that you would like for audiences to come away from your film with, what would that be?
Oof, that's a difficult one. There's a lot of things. I mean, I think that one of the things that I would love people to understand is that, well, I think that we should turn to animals more often as kind of we are animals, but we should look at how animals behave and operate as kind of like lessons and references. And so if we see that migration is something that is, so common and actually leads to survival, we have a tendency, as we were talking about before, of kind of separating ourselves, not only within our own, humanity, but especially from animals. And I think we should turn to them and just kind of observe them and learn from them. And I think that's something that I try to do in my films. And I always say that animals are much better actors than human beings. So that's something that and a lot of my films, just to kind of give, right now I'm working on a film about a jaguar, but a lot of my films tend to have kind of animals as central characters.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, thank you so much for doing this.
And good luck for the film on the rest of the way through the film festival circuit.
Thank you. Yeah, hopefully we'll have some screenings in person at some point. When
Yes,
when
I definitely hope so.